Yes, it's Professor Buzzkill, your second favorite history professor in the entire world, here busting myths and taking names. And I'm your second favorite because your first favorite is here. And that's, of course, Dr. Philip Nash from Penn State, who's here to talk to us about the Cuban Missile Crisis. How are you, Professor? Thanks for coming on the show.
I am doing great, as always, and thank you so much. You are, as always, too kind.
Well, your shows are by far the most popular, and you're our number one star with a bullet, as they say. Ha get it? Bullet missile crisis. Ha. But more seriously, of course, Dr. Nash, we are coming up on a very important anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Am I right?
Absolutely. This would be the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 60 years ago.
Later this month. Wow, that is amazing. We once did a show about the Cuban Missile Crisis a long time ago in the show's early beginnings, but we have a different format now, so we wanted to do it again. And of course, we wanted to do it because of this anniversary and all the attention it will receive. But Professor, why was there a Cuban Missile Crisis?
Why? Where do Cuban Missile Crises come from?
Right, exactly.
It's a good question. So I'm going to start really, really basic. Obviously, this is in the depths of, the early Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, right? Global struggle for dominance had been going on since the late 1940s. That is the most basic reason. The secondly is what I would call nuclear attachment. This is now, 17 years into the nuclear age. Both sides are heavily armed with nuclear weapons.
1962 was 17 years.
Correct. Yes, I'm sorry. 17 years into the nuclear age. Both sides by this point are, shall we say, very much wedded to nuclear weapons to solve military, but also in some cases political problems. In other words, they're sort of almost like a security blanket, literally and figuratively. And so nuclear war was a serious threat before this. This is going to be the most serious point. We'll talk about that later, most serious point of sort of nuclear threat. But there had been earlier nuclear crises. Nuclear saber rattling, using nuclear weapons for all sorts of military and political purposes was well established. And so, that's important to know because in a way, while this is an extraordinary event, it is in some ways just more of the same, right?
Oh, okay.
Both sides sort of using nuclear weapons to try and solve problems in different ways. And then there's this third layer, which is the national liberation struggles in the developing world all over the place in this period, which were coming to fruition, right? And I mean, just one of my favorite factoids is the year 1960 saw 17 new independent countries in Africa.
That is amazing. Yeah.
Right. So you have a lot of struggles. The European empires are crumbling, and you have national liberation struggles. And in this case, specifically the island of Cuba, 90 miles off of Key West. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in a revolution which not at first, but ultimately became very clearly communist in its orientation, and for lots of good reasons was directed against the United States, right? This was partly to get Cuba out from under U.S. domination. And so U.S.-Cuban relations collapsed rather quickly, starting in the spring of 1959. The United States was a threat to Cuba. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower, the U.S. president, had authorized a big CIA program to invade Cuba with anti-Castro Cuban exiles. This was known as Operation Zapata. This was going to ultimately, we'll talk about later, it was going to result in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then what happened is the Cubans, because they felt threatened by the United States, reached out to the Soviet Union to protect itself.
Right.
And the Soviet Union at the same time was absolutely delighted. Its leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was delighted to have a new friend in the Western Hemisphere because it had no friends in the Western Hemisphere. And geostrategically, by this point, the Soviet Union is hemmed in by a ring of U.S.-sponsored alliances all around Eurasia and is really eager to break out of that sort of encirclement. And one way you do that is you get a friend in the Western Hemisphere in the form of Fidel Castro. So already early 1960, Soviet representatives are showing up in Cuba. They're building a relationship which includes defense cooperation. And it becomes sort of mutual escalation. So the Cubans feel like they're just defending themselves by reaching out to the Soviets, who, for example, start to buy up Cuban sugar, right? Because the United States imposes an economic embargo and stops buying Cuban sugar. Cuba relies on sugar sales, and so the Soviets say, we'll buy it all. And so increasingly the United States, for its part, starts to freak out over the fact that now seems to be a communist outpost in the Western Hemisphere, right? We're always very sensitive with the Monroe Doctrine, et cetera, right?
Sure.
We consider the Caribbean in particular our, quote unquote, our backyard. And now the big bad Soviets seem to be muscling their way in. John F. Kennedy, running for president as a Democrat in 1960, made a huge issue out of Cuba.
Yeah.
Hammering the Republicans for having done too little, right? In effect, for losing Cuba, the way that Republicans had hammered Democrats for losing China during the Truman years.
And of course, his opponent in that election was Nixon,
correct,
who was Eisenhower's vice president, so
that's right.
really right in there.
Absolutely right.
Okay, well then, Kennedy wins in 1960, the election 1960. So what does he do with this situation that, in theory, anyway, he's inherited?
Right. Well, and keep in mind, since he made a big issue of Cuba in 1960, he feels like he has to follow through on it. When he is informed about this secret CIA plan to invade Cuba with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, the Operation Zapata, he feels heavy pressure to go ahead with it, which he does. This leads in April 1961 to the infamous Bay of Figs.
There probably is a Bay of Figs somewhere.
The outtakes in this are going to be great. The Bay of Pigs invasion. This is April 1961. It ends in humiliating defeat. All of the invaders are, and people should go read about the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Oh, Lordy,
it was a dumpster fire like you can't even imagine. Or maybe you can. Anyway, so these anti-Castro invaders, they are almost entirely killed or captured. They were rounded up. It's a humiliating defeat. But then for our purposes, it's important that JFK doubles down. In other words, he doubles down on an hardcore sort of anti-Cuban set of policies, which would include a tightened economic embargo.
Right.
CIA's Operation Mongoose. This was launched in November 1961.
What, by the way, does the CIA ever have boring names? Is it Operation Mongoose, Operation Zapata, which is obviously Emilio?
Right, exactly. Actually, sometimes they're pretty boring. Like, for example, their station in Miami, which ran Operation Mongoose, was known as JM Wave. Which doesn't
sounds
have
like a radio station.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have any particular meaning. Mongoose, of course, is very unsubtle because mongooses kill snakes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So anyway, just for those of you wondering, like, why mongoose? So this was a massive covert action program. By the way, the CIA station, when Mongoose was in full swing, the CIA station in Miami was the largest on the planet.
Wow.
The CIA did not have a bigger station anywhere in
Not
the
even
world
in West
than
Berlin?
JM Wave. Nope.
Wow.
That's how big they were on taking down Castro's Cuba. So this was a covert action program, which included things like sabotage in Cuba, of course, and also propaganda. So they're separate from Mongoose. There were a series of plots to assassinate Castro. We could do a whole show on these. Maybe we should someday. This included things like exploding seashells and exploding cigars. And
I've often wondered whether that exploding cigar thing was a myth, but we'll worry about
no,
that.
that's true. And they also they had a plan to spray his press box with LSD so he'd freak out during a press conference.
Oh, God.
I
wonder what they called that operation. Operation Jefferson Airplane.
Thank you. Yeah, that I do not know. By the way, they hired the mafia to do some of these. Anyway, this also included a series of threatening military maneuvers in the Caribbean. So large land, sort of amphibious invasions. Like one was on the island of Vieques. And I believe that one was directed at a mythical leader, right? The target in this operation was a mythical leader whose name was Ortsac, Ortsac, which if you hold a mirror up to it or spell it backwards, it spells Castro. Very subtle.
Come on, I mean,
they're really heavy on military ability and low on wit.
Well, I mean, we have some of our workmen and some of the people who our maids and servants in the Buzzkill Institute who are smarter than that.
They could have figured that out. Yeah. Anyway, so the United States was definitely a threat to Cuba, and this is important because long after the missile crisis, you could find veterans of the Kennedy administration who would play innocent. They would say stuff like, "Well, we had no intention of invading Cuba." You can excuse the Cubans and the Soviets for thinking that the United States, the only thing it had learned from the Bay of Pigs was, well, next time we'll do it with U.S. forces and we'll add some zeros to the size of the invading force.
Yeah.
So Cuba had every reason to think that the United States was going to invade someday.
Okay, well, that's JFK and Castro. What about Khrushchev?
Right. What about
Who's relatively new still? Or is it 9 years in power?
No, yeah. So but the question is, because they had collective leadership for a while, he's sort of firmly in charge no later than 1957.
Okay.
So he's been in there, certainly been in there longer than JFK. But the Soviets, led by Khrushchev, they are increasingly concerned about their new ally in the Caribbean. There is this famous summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in early June 1961, which is largely inconclusive, but one of the results is that Khrushchev sort of bullies Kennedy at the meeting and basically confirms his belief that Kennedy is sort of callow and young and inexperienced, and so that Khrushchev can take liberties with him and get away with things he might not be able to get away with someone else. And that's part of the background of, like, why is Khrushchev going to do something so foolish as try to put missiles in Cuba? I think one of the reasons is he underestimated Kennedy as a leader.
Okay. All right.
Because, Khrushchev also reopens the Berlin crisis, which had been simmering in the summer of 1961.
Yep.
Tensions are high, right? That's the summer where you have the wall built.
Yep. We
right,
did a show on that.
Right, exactly, which helps actually solve the crisis more than anything. But the tensions are very, very high. And, Kennedy launches sort of a mini military buildup in late July 1961 as a response to this. Fast forward to spring 1962 when Khrushchev decides on Operation Anadyr.
Okay, now hang on. What is Anadyr backwards? It's A-N-A-D-Y-R. R-Y-D.
Ridana? Yeah, no.
Right. Maybe they don't have as many
exactly.
good people on their side coming up with
No,
anagrams.
they take a different approach with naming things. This is the name of a Siberian river. So this is one of those things that is just intended to mislead.
Right. Right. Could be anything.
Exactly. I mean, it's not Operation Put Missiles in Cuba.
And in fact, given that it's after Siberian River, someone might think it's about China rather than...
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So this is definitely the approach I would take.
I'm glad we were following this running joke, Professor. The listeners will love it.
I honestly think there's bad day to get a PhD in history, but there's a PhD to be written about the naming of operations, like military and intelligence operations around the world. I think there's something to that.
Well, and because this Ortsack Castro backwards thing is just
that's a low point. I prefer like enduring freedom, like the heavy-handed super patriotism. I prefer that approach.
Well, Ortsack sounds, that's middle school level. Anyway,
pretty
I'm interrupting the flow.
So the Operation Anadyr, this is the secret deployment of strategic nuclear missiles. So in other words, by that, the definition of strategic is missiles that can reach the territory of the adversary.
Right.
As opposed to, say, battlefield nuclear weapons, like tactical nuclear weapons,
right,
which you use just on the battlefield. So the secret deployment of nuclear weapons, including intermediate range ballistic missiles, and I'll say more about the actual weapons in a minute, to Cuba. So
why would he do that?
Right. Why this particular move, which, at least in retrospect, pretty high risk,
yeah,
as you might imagine. So his first reason, as we've already alluded to defend Cuba. You use the ultimate deterrent, a nuclear deterrent, to, by the way, compensate for your local conventional inferiority. Cuba's army, any Soviet forces in Cuba, cannot match the conventional force that the Americans can bring to bear in the Caribbean.
Right. Gotcha.
You can't hope to do that. And so what you do is you compensate with the ultimate weapon, large nuclear weapons that can reach the United States, which, by the way, for the record, is exactly what the United States had been doing at the same time for years in Western Europe.
Exactly.
We were woefully inferior in size to the Red Army on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and so we compensated with nuclear weapons. And so in that sense, for Americans to say, wow, how could they do something like this? In a way, this is, like I said, this is part of nuclear attachment. You use nuclear weapons to solve various military and political problems, and this is just another one of those problems. Now, we can argue about this particular move. And by the way, Khrushchev could have done things to defend Cuba, including tactical nuclear weapons and a conventional buildup that could have defended Cuba without threatening the United States.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, I'm trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, this is logical. On the other hand, this is illogical and really, really risky.
Or going too far.
Exactly. So defend Cuba, number one. Number two, catch up in the nuclear arms race more broadly. It turns out by spring of 62, there was a missile gap, but that the Soviets were on the receiving end, not on the giving end. By this point, they had failed miserably. They had been the first with Sputnik to demonstrate a capability of intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? A missile that can reach from the Soviet Union to the United States. They had that capability first. They failed to translate it into an operational force of ICBMs. We, by this point, had.
Okay.
And so in 62, we had about a 4-to-1 advantage in ICBMs. And if you look at total strategic weapons, most of them sort of like nuclear weapons dropped from B-52 bombers.
Yeah.
We had something like a 17-to-1 advantage.
That's enormous.
Yeah, it's an enormous disparity. And so the Soviets did have an operational and reliable force of IRBMs, intermediate range missiles. These are missiles with a range of between about 1,500 and 2,000 miles.
Oh, still a long way.
Still a long way, but you can't reach the United States from the Soviet Union. However, if you have a new friend 90 miles from the United States, then your IRBMs in effect become ICBMs just by sort of waving your magic wand.
Okay.
So this is a quick way not to catch up in the strategic nuclear arms race, but to make the gap a little narrower.
Yeah, and we should remind Buzzkillers that, Cuba is closer than, for instance, our own territory of Puerto Rico.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And
So-
by the way, if you go deep into the weeds of the weapons, these actually give the United States less reaction time than an ICBM does. right?
Yeah, it's gotta come out, right.
Your radar would pick up an ICBM long before you would detect a launch from Cuba, which you could argue makes this another reason this is a risky move, because you've threatened strategic stability by reducing warning times. Anyway, this was also thirdly, and this is not a primary reason, the secondary reason, but this was a response to the Jupiter IRBMs that had been deployed by NATO in the late Eisenhower, early Kennedy years, especially in places like Turkey, which does border on the Soviet Union. And this really stuck in Khrushchev's craw. He apparently used to visit the Black Sea and look across. He would be with friends, and he'd look across the sea with his binoculars, and he would say, "You know what I see? I see U.S. missiles pointed at my dacha."
Yeah.
Almost like he took this personally. And there is something, the same with Cuba, by the way, in the United States, there is something psychological about having nuclear weapons situated next to you, as opposed to far away from you, even though there may not be any real world difference, right? Those weapons are both going to vaporize you. One takes longer to get to you, but there is something psychological about having sort of hostile nuclear weapons in a neighboring territory. And he was clearly bugged by them. And Khrushchev in his memoirs actually said, with this deployment in Cuba, we would be doing nothing but giving, and this is virtual quotation, we'd be giving the Americans a little of their own medicine. So there's almost this sort of petty revenge motive as well. Like, now you know what it feels like.
By the way, Buzzkillers, I remember a young professor a few years ago wrote a book called The Other Missiles of October, which is about the Jupiters in Turkey, and he's sitting right across from me in the Buzzkill bunker here. And we're, in addition to what we're going to put on the Buzzkill bookshelf for this show, we're also going to put that book. That's a very important book.
It is still in print, but you're right. As one of my teachers once said, that professor you referred to was criminally young when he wrote that book. That was a long, long time ago. So the Soviets felt sort of, and by the way, this was one of the reasons that Khrushchev thought he could get away with this, because in his mind, he was doing nothing extraordinary.
Yeah. So if he presented this to the UN, they might say, well, tit for tat.
It's a great question, because that's one of the things that the Kennedys are going to, in my view, exaggerate, which is, you did this secretly. That's not fair. And we can argue about that, because, we didn't announce the Bay of Pigs invasion in advance.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of secrecy and skullduggery going around.
Yeah.
But that did give in terms of propaganda and sort of public relations, it gave the Kennedys something to say, well, this was a secret deployment, and that's not right. And then there's a final factor, which is, and I think this sometimes gets overlooked, by 1962, the Sino-Soviet split is wide open.
Split between Soviets and China.
The Soviets and Communist China. And there is, by this point, a competition for the allegiance of socialists around the world between Beijing and Moscow.
Oh, now this I did not know at all.
Yeah, no, this is important, because the Chinese, they're sort of the new kid on the block. They seem to be younger and more sort of vital. And, remember, like I said, lots of new independent countries, some of them leaning towards socialism. You're looking for a role model. And the Chinese are like, you can have the young, sort of hip.
Yeah.
The swinging commies, or you can have those old farts in the Kremlin.
Without the Stalinistic stain.
Exactly. There's that. There's also, the Soviet Union is more interested in peaceful coexistence, right? It's trying to avoid World War III. The Chinese maybe a little more bellicose.
Right.
And so so if you can deploy missiles in Cuba and sort of strike a blow for global socialism like this, like a real bold move, you can gain a lot of your cred back in terms of worldwide communist allegiance. So that's also sort of in the back of Khrushchev's mind. So in the Presidium, which is that's sort of like the Politburo, it goes by different names, sort of Khrushchev's inner circle, there are a few, like his right-hand man, Anastas Mikoyan, who raise objections to this, who realize that this is super risky. But basically, the Soviet leadership model it's pretty top down. It comes a great shock, and everyone falls into line.
Even under Khrushchev, who, as you say, had gone through this interim power sharing.
That's right.
But then eventually became in.
Yeah, and he is definitely no Joseph Stalin.
No, and everybody knows that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so what about now when we get to this stage, right? What about Castro? What's he doing?
Right, because he is theoretically in a position to say, no, we don't want these. We don't want to become, a target for a nuclear attack.
Yeah, I didn't think about that either.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
In other words, we're already threatened by the United States. Why would you provoke the United States even further? That would have been a perfectly logical response.
Yeah.
He actually wanted a formal alliance with the Soviet Union, like the Warsaw Pact or NATO, to protect him. And the Soviet offer of strategic nuclear missiles came as a surprise. The Cubans were not expecting this.
Oh.
But then, from everything we know, it turns out that he would then accept this offer with little hesitation. he definitely understands the logic of defending his regime, right? If you have the ultimate deterrent, then you know for sure the United States will never mess with you. There is that, right? That has logic to it, no question. Like I said, just like in Europe. He is also sort of young and committed, and he's not sort of a old, jaded, cynical communist leader of the type you might expect. He is also interested in, as he said, he's interested in strengthening the socialist camp. Right. In other words, this is by accepting these missiles, I'm doing something for global socialism. I'm not just doing something to defend the Cuban Revolution. That was, as far as we know, that was Castro's take on this, and that's one of the reasons he agreed to do it.
And he is, in fact, younger than both Khrushchev and Mao.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Now we're at the stage where the USSR is planning actually to send the missiles. What do they send?
Right. What is in this goodie basket for Fidel Castro? It's quite. I mean, I'm not going to give you all the details because it's quite extensive. It's called the Group of Soviet Forces in Cuba, I guess the GSFC.
Oh, no, not another one.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry. The Group of Soviet Forces in Cuba, it included lots of stuff. The most important things were 36 R-12s. These are medium range, so there's a distinction. These are shorter range, but they're then IRBMs, but they're not tactical weapons. So these are 36. And by the way, I think there's 36 missiles and 24 launchers. So theoretically, you could reload the launcher with missiles. Right?
Oh yeah, okay.
But you have to have both, obviously. So 36 R-12s, as the Soviets called them. It has a 1,200 mile range. It had a 1 megaton warhead. So just for comparison purposes, that's a warhead that's 66 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb.
Lordy.
Yeah, so these are, in the middle of the Cold War, the largest nuclear weapons were unbelievably destructive. And I'm here to tell you, 1 megaton is actually still pretty small. And that's megaton, that means 1 million tons of TNT equivalent.
Yeah, Lord.
So 1,200 mile range, that means it could reach about, you can go online and look at the maps, it reaches about the southeastern third of the continental United States, including Washington, D.C., by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the 36 R-12s. Also, they plan to send 24 R-14s. These are intermediate range missiles. These are more like the Jupiters and the Thors that the NATO had in Europe. These had a 2,300 mile range. That reaches pretty much the entire, with maybe the exception of Seattle, it reaches the entire 48 states, the lower 48 states.
Okay, now this is interesting because usually the classic maps that I see, there's these range arcs.
Right, exactly.
And usually takes in Washington but that's about, I've never seen maps that show that
with the longer
does
one.
The whole one.
That actually may have been a really up-to-date map because as we'll see, spoiler alert, these longer range missiles never actually made it to Cuba. They were kept out by the blockade.
Spoilers. Yeah, but still, they want to do that, which is
correct.
Terrifying.
Absolutely right, and they could cover the entire 48 states. These had a much bigger warhead, a 2.3 megaton warhead. That's 150 times roughly the size of the little man bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So incredibly destructive. And by the way, a single 2.3 megaton warhead detonated over a U.S. city would cause catastrophic damage, hundreds of thousands of deaths if the city's big enough.
Right.
So just a single one of these, keep that in mind too. That's one of the reasons why the United States is not going to invade, because it's what the political scientists call minimum deterrence. If I have to worry about just a single one of your warheads making it through after I've destroyed all the rest of your warheads, I still might be deterred because I'm still not.
Sure.
Right, because something that destructive, I'm not willing to absorb that loss, even though it's quote unquote only one bomb.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. God.
Yeah. So it
These
also
are horrific sort of things to make decisions on.
No, and this is, by the way, just big picture, at this time, if you look at the entire U.S. arsenal and if you look at the U.S. strategic war plan, our war plan was to just dump thousands and thousands of strategic weapons on the Soviet Union, the Sino-Soviet bloc. It would have killed hundreds of millions of people. It was the equivalent, I've seen the figure, the equivalent was 600,000 Hiroshima-sized blasts.
Wow.
That's what, and that would have
600,000.
Imagine 600,000, the equivalent of 600,000 Hiroshima blasts, and that's just if the United States uses its weapons alone and no one else does.
Not 600, not 6,000, 600,000.
Yes, it was called overkill for a reason. So this GSFC also included tactical nuclear weapons, which could not reach the United States, but were intended to be used against a U.S. invasion.
Okay.
These, by the way, were about Hiroshima size.
Now, here's a question I have, though. If the United States invades Cuba and you're talking about dropping these tactical nukes on the invading force, are
Correct.
you also destroying a lot of Cuba?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yes, no question.
So the calculations again here are just shocking.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's, presumably these would be landing beaches. in areas that were not necessarily very heavily populated. So you might not have massive civilian casualties.
Yeah, but still.
But yes, but you would be affecting, Cuba, no question. It also included conventional jet fighters, a significant number of Soviet ground troops, and also surface-to-air missiles, the sort of S-75. These are very sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles of the type that shot down the U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960, the Francis Gary Powers shoot down.
Yeah.
So those are also sent to Cuba. So this is a lot of the latest Soviet weaponry. The shipments began in August. The United States believed, and this is one of those cases in history where you assume something and then you make decisions based on your assumptions and then you regret it later. The United States assumed that the Soviet Union would not be so foolish as to try to put in strategic nuclear weapons in Cuba. The CIA director, John McCone, he thought they would. Everyone else in the Kennedy administration thought that they wouldn't do that. They thought that Khrushchev was sort of a loose cannon, but even he wouldn't do anything this stupid, this rash.
Right.
And they knew about the conventional buildup. And they monitored it pretty carefully, but they thought it would be conventional. They thought that this was just conventional stuff that was used to defend Cuba. And because the United States didn't think that he would send nuclear weapons, in September, twice, the United States publicly warned the Soviets, don't put nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Yeah.
The deployment was already underway.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. Had the United States made such a warning back in, March, we might not be doing the show right now. Who knows?
Yeah.
In any case, Khrushchev's deployment was already underway. U.S. U-2 flights, so reconnaissance flights over Cuba with their very, very good photographic equipment. These flights that might have discovered the missiles just as the construction began, these flights were stopped for a 5-week period in September, October 1962, partly because of weather, partly because of the fear of another shoot down.
Yeah,
right. We didn't want another incident.
Yeah,
and by the way, the United States this is going into midterm elections.
There's always
domestic politics. And the Kennedy people would deny this was about domestic politics. It's always in part about domestic politics, even this. So the flights were resumed on October 14th, and that's when the missile deployment was discovered, and the photos were given to Kennedy in the White House.
Well, Buzzkillers, we are going to have to take a little break for advertisement from our sponsors to pay the bills, and we will get back in a moment to see how JFK reacted, and then, of course, what happened for the rest of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back in a sec. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, with Professor Philip Nash, your favorite Buzzkiller, and we're talking, of course, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 60th anniversary, which is now upon us. Before we went on the break, Professor, we had got all the way up to the point where the Soviets have planned what they're going to send, and the shipments have begun. So how did JFK react?
Right. Once he is given irrefutable proof that these missiles are there and they are under construction. So Kennedy famously, and we know a lot about this, we have a lot of tape recordings from these meetings.
Yeah.
And when we don't, we have the top secret minutes. We probably know more about U.S. decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis than just about any other historical event involving U.S. policymakers.
Wow.
Because Kennedy was secretly keeping, and it's a historian's dream, because not only are the conversations being taped, almost everyone in the room doesn't even know they're being taped.
Well, and tell the Buzzkillers why that is. Why does he tape the stuff in the first place?
Well, yeah. Well, this is for, and this, of course, this is going to lead a secret recording road that's going to end up in Watergate ultimately.
Yeah.
But usually the explanation I see is that this is about posterity, that this is going to help the president write his memoirs, that sort of thing. I mean, it's actually pretty mundane. Nixon and Johnson, I think, were probably a little more interested in being able to check the record in case someone has a meeting with the president and lies about what happened later on, and then he can say, well, let's roll the tape.
Oh, okay. So the story
Right.
about JFK starting this because he was pissed off about being lied to, in theory, about the Bay of Pigs is not necessarily...
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay.
No, in fact, he doesn't start taping his conversations until the summer of 1962. I'm pretty sure. And by the way, and they're out there. You can listen to a lot of these recordings online, and there are also bound, annotated editions of these tapes put up by the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. It's really awesome sources.
Some of them are really hilarious, by the way. Sorry to keep going on this. He calls Pat Brown, the governor of California, in 1962 after Nixon has lost the gubernatorial election, and they have this hilarious...
a little bit of Schadenfreude.
Guffawing conversation about Nixon's... You don't have Dick Nixon.
Oh, right,
kick
around. Yeah.
And they talk about, and Pat Brown says he's, the man's a psycho. Anything.
No, some of these recordings, even on issues like Vietnam, are absolutely crucial to our understanding of the history. So Kennedy starts meeting secretly with his top advisors for several days. And ultimately, this is going to be called the XCOM, which is short for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It's sort of an ad hoc group of his top advisors. They start meeting secretly. Honestly, I think sometimes their importance is exaggerated, and we had movies like The Missiles of October in the 1970s and 13 Days, and,
Bobby Kennedy wrote that book.
Right, exactly. And so I think it was not really a decision-making body, in my view. It was more about a sounding board. It was for consensus formation. As we'll see, Kennedy didn't always go along with what the majority said, right?
Yeah.
Like, Lincoln famously said, I'm the only yes vote, but the ayes have it.
Yeah.
So the consensus immediately reached was that the missiles must be removed. And that's interesting, too. The question is why? Why did you immediately, all of you, conclude that these missiles, we cannot tolerate them? Part of it is just nuclear attachment, right? Nuclear weapons are the sort of the currency of the superpower competition. You just can't abide the idea that the enemy would do something like this and get away with it. There are fears about credibility, right? Especially after you publicly warned the Soviets not to do this. If it's revealed they've done this and then you don't do anything, that looks really, really bad, right? And that also then blends into the whole question of domestic politics. There's one point where Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General and the President's brother, said, if you hadn't done anything, you would have been impeached.
Well, not surprised.
Which I mean, you can't necessarily dispute that, but it does show you how sort of domestic politics and domestic public opinion is very much on their mind, right? They're not making these decisions in a vacuum. But it is interesting, as far as we can tell, they don't seem to have been very concerned about the military balance. In other words, even though Khrushchev wants to deploy these partly to correct the strategic imbalance, the Americans don't view it that way. They don't see like, oh, this is going to upset the nuclear balance. There's one meeting where the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, says, yeah, the Joint Chiefs think these missiles are important in terms of the military balance. I don't think they're important at all, which is interesting, right? You would think, and maybe you'd even want to sort of hope that these decisions are being made on strategic grounds primarily. But that's pretty clearly not the case here. This is about these other things. This is about credibility. It's about domestic politics. It's about just your general political view of nuclear weapons and not about sort of the bean counting, right? Like who has how much of what. That doesn't, you see very little discussion of that, like, what the Soviets will be able to do with these missiles. Very little discussion of that, if any, in the hours and hours and hours of conversations they have. So most, including JFK, their first preference was for an airstrike, right? A military attack to take out the missiles. And it's interesting, after the missile crisis, Kennedy gave a long interview. You can actually listen to it online. December 1962, a long interview to reflecting back on the missile crisis. And he was asked by a reporter, so what's the most important lesson from the missile crisis? And he immediately said, having lots of time to arrive at the right decision.
Yeah, because the missiles are arriving by ship. They're not flown in.
And I mean, my view is, keep in mind, they have better part of a week to discuss this secretly without anyone knowing in the public or outside that this has gone on, right?
Right.
I always like to do the what if. What if we had a similar thing today?
Lordy,
I mean, how quickly the news would leak, how quickly all the conspiracy theories and the speculation and the actual news would compete on social media, and a president would be forced to make a decision immediately. And if you have to act quickly, you might make the wrong decision. Whereas if you have time to sit down and discuss it and learn, for example, as Kennedy did, that you could have an airstrike, but you could not 100% guarantee every last target would be destroyed. And like I said, if one of those missiles hits New York or Washington, that's a failed policy.
Yeah.
And so by the time you get to about the 20th or 21st, Kennedy's decided that an airstrike is a bad idea, at least at first. The risks were too huge. So he decides instead on a naval blockade, which when they announced it, they called a quarantine.
Now, why did they do that?
Yeah, that's an international legal issue. Blockade, right? Where you put ships between point A and point B and prevent someone from moving in or out. That's an act of war. Under international law. And so there's his State Department legal people were saying, yeah, Mr. President, don't use the B word.
But using the Q word is effectively doing the same thing, isn't it?
Right, and it is also, it gets into this whole sort of almost like disease, right? Sort of metaphor, which is not a really great, very accurate metaphor. But anyway, they call it a quarantine. And the idea is that this will stop further shipments because they know the shipments are ongoing.
Right.
So this will prevent further shipments from reaching Cuba. This will also signal U.S. resolve, right, that we're serious about this. And it also keeps Kennedy's options open, right? If afterwards he decides that the blockade's not getting it done, then he can still do an airstrike and or an invasion, right? That option's still there, and they know it is still there. But like I said, Kennedy later thanked his ability to have long sort of secret discussions to arrive at a better decision, certainly in retrospect. So the crisis becomes public on Monday evening, October 22nd, when JFK addresses the nation on television, live on television and by radio, and he announces the presence of the missiles, demands their removal, and announces the quarantine.
Okay, so that's the 22nd. So how many, did they actually have 13 days as Bobby Kennedy's book says?
So,
or whatever?
yeah, so 13 days, that refers to from the day that Kennedy knows there are missiles there, October 16th, through October 28th.
When the
Soviets announced they're going to withdraw. Now, by the way, I won't mention it later, but technically you can argue that the crisis lasts until November 20th, because that's when you have a definitive agreement, because there had been some haggling over other issues, like the presence of these Soviet nuclear-capable jet bombers in Cuba, which we won't get into. But yeah, 13 days. And by the way, Kennedy gave all the members of XCOM this sort of token of his appreciation. It's this sort of, it's kind of like a pen holder, and it's got engraved. It's got an October 62 calendar, and like the 13 days are in bold. They have them at the Kennedy Library. They're pretty famous. So yeah, 13 days becomes quote unquote a thing, and that's why it's the 16th to the 28th.
Okay, but on the 22nd, he goes on TV, and let's give the Buzzkillers a brief clip from the beginning of that speech.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, well, there we have President Kennedy addressing the nation. This broadcast really, made people think, oh my God, we're close to nuclear war. So what then happens?
Right, what happens next? So the blockade did not go into immediate effect. It goes into effect on October 24th. Mm-hmm. But U.S. military forces were put on high alert, including if you know your defense condition jargon, right? DEFCON 1 through 5. Yeah. DEFCON 5 is sort of peacetime, right? You're not doing anything. DEFCON 1 is basically war footing, and basically war has been declared. So our strategic forces were put on DEFCON 2 for the first, and I believe one of the only times, if not the only time, I forget. In 73, we had a nuclear alert that was pretty high. So our Strategic Air Command was put on very, very high alert. All sorts of conventional forces began redeploying toward Florida, right? Because they would take part in an invasion of Cuba if it comes to that. There was, and here I'm gonna give you what you're really looking for. I'm gonna bust a mini myth.
Oh.
Bonus coverage right here.
Bonus coverage.
So a mini myth, there was no quote unquote eyeball to eyeball moment at the blockade line, right? Where Soviet ships are steaming toward the U.S. Navy blockade, and they turn around at the last minute, and the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, says, I think the other guy just blinked. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, it didn't happen.
Okay. Now I grew up thinking, now this shows you my sort of perverted childhood.
Here's the pop culture aspect.
I was thinking about this when I was a little kid. The story was that, there was a shot over a bow of a Soviet ship as a threat, and there was this line, and they were getting closer and closer to the line, and they sort of had to turn around like Wile E. Coyote or something and run the other way. All that's a myth.
I'm sorry, little Joe. You were misled. Yeah, that's a myth. There was no warning. Now, by the way, later on in the podcast, you'll see there was some incredibly risky behavior on the part of the Americans at the blockade line.
Yeah.
But it was not about confronting Soviet ships. And by the way, there were no Soviet surface warships in the region. These were all freighters. Yeah. So had there been, quote unquote, shooting at the blockade line, it would have been all in one direction.
Yeah, right.
And Soviet freighters would have been quickly sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. But they, hundreds of miles short of the blockade, these ships turned around.
Okay, well, you and I grew up in the in
the 13 days.
Well, the post-assassination Camelot era. So
of course.
All this stuff has been over-dramatized.
A lot of it has.
Okay.
Although, I think a more accurate generalization would be some things have been exaggerated and some things haven't been emphasized enough.
Right,
including some very risky things, as we'll see. But there was no confrontation of the blockade line. And by the way, just to put it in context, this is part of Khrushchev. Once the missile crisis becomes public, what you see from both Khrushchev and Kennedy is, for the most part, very, very risk-averse behavior, right? So I would say both of them deserve criticism for helping get us into, Khrushchev more than Kennedy, of course, but getting us into this crisis. But once the crisis is underway, they are both very, very sober-minded about trying to keep a lid on this. And that includes Khrushchev saying, no, we're not going to approach the blockade line. Those shipments on the way, turn them around right back to the Black Sea.
Right.
So the R-14s, the longer range, the intermediate range missiles that could have reached all the lower 48, it turns out they didn't. In fact, one of the ships that turned around actually had some of the R-14 equipment.
Right, okay.
The R-14s, the longer range missiles, and their warheads did not make it to Cuba. The R-12s with their warheads did. And those are, as the crisis is going on, those are under construction. And some of them actually become ready for use during the missile crisis. And by the way, the United States never has a clear idea, right? You can go over and photograph something, but you don't know if it's actually operational yet.
Right.
We had to assume that they were, just to play it safe, and that turned out to be prudent because some of them were operational, and had there been an airstrike, some of them conceivably could have been launched. So the tensest week of the Cold War follows, and World War III was a distinct possibility.
Okay, I'm not glad you say that, because I didn't want, we don't ever want World War III to have been a distinct possibility now or then. But, that's one of the things that was very heavily played in the 60s and 70s. So it's good to know at least that part is true.
Right. Yeah. And, people like me still are interested in, and people still write a lot of books on the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we all agree it was very, very dangerous, and probably the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. And World War III would have been catastrophic, probably for the entire Northern Hemisphere, if not for all of humankind.
Well, how close then did we come to that World War III?
To my mind, I think that's one of the most fruitful debates that scholars are having right now when they study the missile crisis, because there is a real, if you look at the literature, there's a real disagreement, and I think it's a great discussion to have, because the evidence is contradictory. You can build plausible cases on both sides. There's a very good book out there called The Silent Guns of Two Octobers, which is by Theodore Voorhees. I highly recommend it. Very provocative book. It talks about the Berlin crisis of 61 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 62. He actually argues that the chance of war was relatively low, which is very sort of iconoclastic, I would say. And he basically says, look at how risk-averse Kennedy and Khrushchev were during the missile crisis.
Yeah, what you just said. Yeah,
they were both keen on getting out of this peacefully once the crisis is joined. They both made heavy use of personal back channels, including creating new personal back channels in an effort to solve the crisis peacefully.
Is this where the red phone famously comes in, or is that another
That's
myth?
Afterwards. That actually is a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
The red phone. I'm so glad you said that. Anyway.
I stole your thunder by saying it ahead of time.
And by the way, I think that shows you the importance of Hollywood and shows like Get Smart and stuff like that, right? Because it's always or the bat phone, right? Anyway, so they also on both sides, they took steps to prevent the use during the crisis even of conventional weapons. Including personally, JFK certainly did this, sort of intervening way down the military chain of command to the point where the military is starting to resent your micromanagement. And your comeback is, I want to make darn sure this stuff is not used without my express authorization. So someone like Voorhees argues that the risk of deliberate war was extremely low, and I think that's true.
Right. Okay.
My response and my sort of me at the end of the day coming down on the other side is that the risk of accidental war was very, very high. And to my mind, this case has become stronger and stronger with more and more evidence in recent years. There were many, many accidents and incidents during the crisis. And the problem is that during a crisis, what you know as an accident is more likely to be interpreted as deliberate by your opponent, right? You're going to say, oops, and they're not going to say, oh yeah, well, maybe it was just a mistake.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, incidents and accidents are more likely during a crisis because your forces are on alert, right? You've scrambled. You have your B-52s in the air 24/7, some of them.
People are trigger happy.
Yeah, people are trigger happy, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have all sorts of instances. I honestly do not have time to go through all of them because, once again, that could be its own show. But some of them are famous. Like, for example, a U-2 spy plane on the 27th, the peak day of the crisis, 27th of October, a U-2 spy plane straight into Soviet airspace and barely made it out without being intercepted. And it's because the guy made a navigational error. Yeah. And the problem is that's the kind of thing that could be interpreted as deliberate. Because, for example, if we were about to launch a first strike, one of the things we would do is we would send some aircraft into Soviet airspace to trigger their air defenses. so that then we can pick up on their air defenses and destroy their air defenses to clear a way for our bombers, right? So you could logically say, oh, wow, the Americans are about to launch a first strike, as opposed to this being what it was, which is a navigational error.
And it's 2 years after the Gary Powers thing, so it's not that
correct.
Out of
absolutely, right? The Soviets are still concerned about U-2s and still trying to shoot them down. You also had other things. So one of the things is you have such a vast military establishment, you don't know everything that's going on a routine basis that might be meaningless during peacetime, but really meaningful during a missile crisis. So, for example, we continued, this blew me away when I found out about it many years ago. During the missile crisis, we were continuing our atmospheric nuclear testing program. We were detonating nuclear weapons over the Pacific. That's because, as Kennedy said, there's always some SOB who doesn't get the word.
Right.
It didn't occur to anyone, hey, maybe we shouldn't be detonating nuclear weapons over the Pacific during this crisis. We also did some test launches of ICBMs from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California during the crisis. Why would you do that? We did not cut back on the Mongoose sabotage operations inside Cuba. We had CIA-backed teams in Cuba that were still trying to blow things up during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You would think McNamara would say, and the Secretary of Defense would say, okay, we shut everything down. Either he didn't or didn't get filtered down?
No, they're too busy focusing on the immediate problem. And then you just assume that your standard operating procedures are enough. And they weren't. And by the way, some of the same things could have been going on the Soviet side. We just don't have the documents.
Right.
It's highly likely. Right. But the point here is that neither leader had complete control of their military establishments, nor could they. And yet, it's even more dangerous because they often think they do, right?
Yeah, that's a little bit scary.
It's almost like a really dangerous version of Dunning-Kruger, right? In other words, you think you know everything about your military establishment, and you don't, and then you might just find out the hard way. So, and like I said, a lot of it, there's also it's just plain ignorance. We did not know. In fact, we did not know until years afterwards that the Soviets had deployed tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
We thought that if we invaded Cuba, we would only be facing conventional weapons. But just to give you some idea, someone did the math. Someone looked at the tactical nukes with those 12 kiloton warheads that the Soviets had.
Right.
And what their blast radius is and how destructive they are. And they calculated that had the Germans, someone like General Rommel, if they had had 5 of these at D-Day, they could have wiped out the entire invasion force.
Wow.
All 156,000 men, all 5 landing beaches at D-Day could have been erased with just 5 of these weapons. And by the way, the Soviets had more than 5. They had quite a few. And the Americans didn't even know that. So, and that's the kind of thing, just to ram the point home, if we invade Cuba, our invasion force gets annihilated by these tactical nuclear weapons that we didn't even know the Soviets had. What would our response have been? Would we have not ratcheted up and just gone all out World War III at that point?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we would have, according to Kennedy's announcement on TV.
That's right. Yeah. Sure seems that way. Although, actually, he was referring to weapons hitting the United States, which these wouldn't do. But you're just going to sit back and let your entire, like a huge chunk of your military get wiped out without a response? Yeah.
That could get you impeached.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe a military coup.
Because
the Pentagon would want something a little more forceful. But a corollary to the risk of accidental war is the larger role we now understand that was played by lesser figures or sort of less famous people, right? We often, including scholars, we're guilty of this too. We always focus at the top, right? We focus on Castro and Kennedy and Khrushchev. It turns out that if you're looking farther down and looking at the importance of accidents, then you also have to look at some of these people that we haven't heard of.
Yeah, and of course, that's Buzzkillers know that's one of my big things on the show. We talk about how important all kinds of people are in decision making. Churchill did not win the war by himself. There were thousands of people who were equally responsible.
That's right.
Don't let me get on my horse about that. Okay, these lesser figures, like who?
Well, I'll just touch on a couple who are probably the most important among them. But
right.
I'm not going to talk about, for example, Adlai Stevenson, who was Kennedy's UN advisor. The Kennedys hated him. It turns out he was actually pretty important in helping to suggest a peaceful solution to the crisis, even though the Kennedys are then going to hang him out to dry publicly after the crisis in a real bit of nasty pettiness. Anyway, so one of them is Vasily Arkhipov, who was a Soviet naval officer.
And we've done a Man Crush Monday on him, but we need to update some of these things.
He deserves to be mentioned twice, no question. So there were Soviet conventional submarines at the blockade line lurking under the water.
Okay.
They were part of the deployment to Cuba. These sort of old school conventional submarines. They were being rather violently forced to the surface at the blockade line by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy had detected them and was, for example, dropping practice depth charges to force them to the surface.
Oh, not real ones, but to show them, look, this is coming. The real one will be
just
coming.
to rattle them, to force them to surface. The thing is, apparently when you're in a submarine and these explosions are going off, keep in mind, you're inside a tin can.
Yeah.
And you don't know the difference. You can't say, oh, everyone relax. That's just a practice depth charge. You can easily conclude that they're real depth charges.
Yeah.
So as a result of this, and by the way, they were also at one point, this one submarine, the B-59, the one in question here, had to surface because its batteries were running low. These are basically like the same technology the Germans use with their U-boats, right? They're diesel electric. You have to run your diesel engine on the surface to recharge your electric batteries.
Yeah.
At a certain point, otherwise you're just dead in the water underneath the water. So he has to resurface. And then when he comes to the surface, the Americans also start to buzz him with their anti-submarine warfare aircraft, including firing rounds with their automatic cannon into the water nearby. So very, very violent, hostile acts on the part of the Americans, and lead this one captain, Captain Savitsky, to sort of lose his cool. He sort of flips his lid. And he comes, long story short, very, very close to launching another thing the Americans didn't know the Soviet submarines had, which was a 15-kiloton nuclear torpedo.
Yeah.
Once again, 15 kilotons. That's almost the exact size of the Hiroshima bomb, which he would have launched at the U.S. Navy forces, which included an aircraft carrier and a bunch of other surface vessels. Only the intervention of Vasily Arkhipov, who by chance was on that boat. He was sort of a staff officer that could have been on any one of the 4 boats. He happened to be on B-59. Had he not been, who knows how this would have ended.
So he's below the captain.
Well, no, he's above the captain, but happens to be, actually, no, this is a good question. I forget his exact rank. He's in a position to intervene, and he at least has the captain's ear. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he was in a position to order the captain to do X, Y, Z, but he's an officer of the whole unit.
Oh, I see. So
not of the submarine.
Right.
And as it's sort of like the flag officer of the fleet, right? He doesn't command the ship he's on.
Yeah.
Right. It's a similar thing. So he could have been on any one of these 4 subs. He happened to be on the important one.
Yeah.
And he apparently talked Savitsky out of it. And then it turns out that they were through signaling, right? Through, what is it? The Aldous lamp or whatever they use.
Yeah.
Semaphore. I forget the naval terminology. I'm not a Navy buff. I apologize. But the Americans were able to signal the surface sub officers sort of at the conning tower that we're not trying to sink you. And we just wanted you to come to the surface, right? In other words, we were not engaged in acts of war, even though you thought we were. So that saved the U.S. fleet and potentially World War III. There are lots of people who think that Vasily Arkhipov is the single most important individual in the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can make a good case for that.
Yeah.
There's another one. This story was revealed recently. It awaits documentary confirmation. It's based on the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses, but we don't have the documents. So we know we have the Arkhipov story. That's in black and white. That's well established. This one is less. We're less sure, but is no less harrowing. If it was true, it turns out there was a U.S. cruise missile squadron based in Okinawa. Mm-hmm. These were missiles. They're primitive cruise missiles, nuclear armed. It's called the Mace B. It had a range, I think, of 1,300 miles. So from Okinawa, could hit all sorts of Chinese and Soviet targets. On that same day, October 27th, this 1B squadron received a launch order. Mm-hmm. And there were people there who were ready to carry it out.
Yeah,
because basically
it's an order. Yeah,
yeah, and they sought confirmation at the mission control center, whatever it's called.
Yeah,
they called for confirmation and they got it. Yes, launch order is genuine. There was a Captain William Bassett who thought this was kind of strange that they received a launch order because they hadn't been ordered to DEFCON 1 yet, which is normally you would be ordered to before you received a launch order.
Okay,
and so he thought the confirmation order was bogus, and he actually ordered some of his security people to go and threaten this other lieutenant who was going to go ahead with the launch. And so he insisted on getting a higher level confirmation. So they went up the food chain and confirmed that there was, in fact, no launch order. So he could have possibly, like I said, we don't have confirmation, but if this is true, it's also harrowing. In another case where a relatively low-ranked individual sort of being extra careful, not following standard operating procedures, and actually may have saved the day. And this is just, once again, to sort of beat this dead horse, which is now a dead horse on the show, which is that Kennedy and Khrushchev were not in control of the forces at their disposal. Around the world, millions of personnel, lots of things can go wrong, and lots of things did go wrong.
Well, these things didn't go wrong to the extent that there was World War III, so how was the crisis resolved?
It's much more complicated than I'm presenting it here. This is sort of this is the right Reader's Digest version. No,
it's not the reader. It is the Professor Buzzkill version.
I'm sorry,
which means it's very well sourced.
I did not mean to sell the show short.
So Reader's Digest Buzzkill is for the younger ones out there.
Wait, what is he talking about?
Was this weekly magazine, and it was
all sorts of it was
crap.
Right.
Basically.
It was the Cliff Notes versions of all sorts of fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, but they had people like Paul Harvey writing.
Oh,
these,
yeah.
It was all crap.
No, it was bad. Anyway, so on the 26th of October, Khrushchev privately offered to withdraw the missiles in return for what's called a no invasion pledge. In other words, Kennedy would say, "We will never invade Cuba." Kennedy and his people, when they received that offer on the evening, so the Washington time, the evening of the 26th, they were relieved because they had expected a demand for a missile trade. In other words, Soviets will pull their missiles out of Cuba if the United States pulls its missiles out of Turkey.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Remember those Turkish missiles?
Right. Those famous Turkish. And like I said, like you said earlier, I can recommend a good book on the subject where you could learn more than you could ever hope to know about the missiles in Turkey. And they had expected this. By the way, this had been discussed on every day of the crisis, despite later denials. The Kennedy people had talked about this all the time. What if he asked for a demand of missiles? Kennedy himself thought that there was obvious logic and obvious appeal to this, right? To the public, as he said on the 27th in XCOM, he said, to any reasonable person out there, this would look like a reasonable offer. And so they were relieved that this didn't come. But that relief was premature. The next morning, the very mercurial Khrushchev, he's feeling bolder, and partly the ebb and flow of this end of the crisis period partly has to do with Khrushchev's constantly changing assessment as to what he can get away with, right? And so he's sort of conservative one moment, a little more bold the next moment, then he goes conservative again. So the morning of the 27th, the Washington Times, he's feeling bolder, and he publicly ups the ante by demanding a missile trade.
Yeah.
Publicly demands a missile trade, Turkey for Cuba. This puts the Kennedy people on the spot. In XCOM, they have actually 3 meetings that day. They're spending a lot of hours and hours and hours discussing this. In those meetings, it's quite clear most of the XCOM members were opposed to a trade. Kennedy was very much in favor. And this is one of these cases, not 100%, but pretty much, like I said, with Lincoln, the eyes have it.
Yeah.
And what he basically does is he basically ignores his XCOM. And he goes around them, and he meets with a smaller group, and they agree, his closer advisors, they agree to send Bobby Kennedy, who now has a secret back channel to the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. They've established a sort of a back channel, personal contact to sort of short circuit all the other nonsense that slows down communications. By the way, in case I forget, at one point in the Cuban Missile Crisis, messages between the Americans and the Soviets in Washington are being moved around Washington, D.C. by Western Union bicycle courier.
You're kidding.
I am not. I wish I were.
You mean, was that sort of deliberate, like no one would ever
No, that was standard operating procedure. That's how you sent messages.
But they were coded, maybe, or was just anybody read them?
No, they weren't coded. I think they were labeled, top secret or confidential or whatever. But yeah, there's some guy pedaling through DC traffic with something that could determine the fate of the world.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's going to help explain some of the, shall we say, reforms in communications that come later. So he ups the ante. Kennedy is in favor of this, so he ignores his advisors for the most part. He sends RFK to Dobrynin with the offer of a secret and sequential missile trade. In other words, a missile trade that doesn't look like a missile trade.
Right, okay.
So in other words, Soviets pull their missiles out. A few months later, we will quietly remove our missiles from Turkey. Everyone's happy. The Soviets aren't entirely happy with this because what they want is a public trade that's where the linkage is clear. This is a trade that's secret and sequential, and so it's deniable, which the Americans will do until proof of this is definitively delivered in 1989. 89. People suspected a trade. Some people, Kennedy's opponents, suspected a trade immediately, but they had no proof.
Yeah.
It could always be denied. It was confirmed by Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's confidant and speechwriter, in 1989. So it's not speculation anymore. There was a trade, but it was secret and sequential. And by the way, also went along with the no invasion pledge.
Which also shows, by the way, since it was 1989, Lord knows how many years later, because I can't do the math right. New stuff comes to light all the time. This is how history changes most of the time.
New stuff has come to light, yes. So the risk of war on that October 22nd definitely had reached its peak. There was a U-2 plane famously shot down over Cuba by one of the Soviet SAMs. Then, by the way, that shooting down of the U-2, not authorized by the Kremlin.
Right.
That was a local decision.
Yikes.
Once again,
Okay.
you don't control your military assets, right? That could have led to World War III. That night, Kennedy said to one of his many mistresses, this is recent information, because he left the room, came back after taking a phone call, comes back in, and he said, and I'm quoting, "I'd rather my children be red than dead."
Wow.
In other words, the risk of war was real, and he was feeling it.
So he was saying, I'm not going to react to that, because I'd rather have my children be red. I'd rather my children be red than dead.
Well, no. That was not linked to the U-2 shoot down. But generally speaking, he was much more interested in preventing World War III.
Yeah.
Even if for example, he had to do a public missile trade. It's possible because he's put this back
Okay,
channel
I
in
gotcha.
place for that. It's possible he would have been okay with a public missile trade as a last resort because he was so bent on avoiding World War III. And unfortunately, some of his advisors were not quite so risk averse. And that's sort of the good news here is that this is a case where, as far as we know, we had the right person in the right place at the right time. Some of his advisors, certainly the chairs of the Joint Chiefs, their attitude was essentially bring it. We will completely crush them in any war, so we don't need to worry about the risk of war.
Lordy.
Which is a really frightening stance.
This reminds me, by the way, Professor, back when we talked about the Berlin Wall a few years ago, Kennedy makes that statement, a wall is better than a war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he was definitely a cooler head when it comes to nuclear war, even though, for example, he helps multiply the nuclear overkill, right? They have a massive defense buildup on his watch.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, he deserves low marks in a lot of other realms, but not in terms of his risk aversion. Anyway, the Soviets announced they were withdrawing the missiles. And by the way, they sent this message via Radio Moscow. They announced it publicly, and that was partly to cut to the chase. They wanted they wanted the Americans to know immediately that they were agreeing to withdraw their missiles. They didn't want any delay.
So none of this back channel stuff, none of the
not
Soviet
in this case.
version of Western Union.
No, the deal was worked out through the back channels.
Yeah, right.
But the announcement, yes, we agree to remove our missiles, and the Americans are going to agree not to invade Cuba. The trade stuff was all secret. And by the way, the Americans said, if you go public with this trade, the deal's off. That was made clear. That was made clear to Dobrynin when RFK met with him. If you're wondering, though, so why did Khrushchev change his mind again and decide to cave, in effect? He had gotten spooked again. He had received a letter from Castro at this key moment, and Castro was essentially, according to the Soviets, it's not quite so clear, but according to the Soviets, the way they read the letter was, Comrade Fidel is basically urging us to launch a first strike. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, that's not a real comforting signal at this high point of the crisis, right?
Yeah.
Khrushchev and his advisors also found out that Kennedy was going to address the nation in a few hours. Mm-hmm. And then they start to freak. It's like, oh, why would he do that? Is he going to announce an invasion?
Yeah.
Highly possible. They didn't want to go down that road. So that's when Khrushchev's like, okay, that's it. We're gonna do the deal, right? No invasion pledge, secret missile deal, and just pull our missiles out.
Well, Professor, we always ask this. You always provide it. You know, lots of people, for instance, I can think of the Buzzlings are now in their late teens. You know, they're going to think, why is this important? What's the bottom line?
Who cares? That happened 60 years ago.
And it didn't bring about World War III.
Exactly.
So
right. It's something that didn't happen. So why would we care? So in terms of the history, the missile crisis certainly had some short and medium term stabilizing effects. I'll call them stabilizing effects. Mm-hmm. For example, it helped lead to a thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations, which helped lead to the limited test ban, right, which banned atmospheric nuclear testing.
Right. Which is a really big deal, actually.
It is a big deal, certainly as a public health measure, right, because people were being dosed with radiation. They weren't anymore after this. Also, I alluded to it. You did have the two sides were mutually concerned about the poor means of communication available during the missile crisis.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they installed the hotline, and that is often interpreted as the flashing red phone.
Oh, I thought that was a red phone.
No,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, all right.
No. And by the way, if you see, there are certain movies like, what's that movie is called? It's called Failsafe.
Oh, yeah.
With Henry Fonda.
Yeah.
And there they've got the two phones where they're talking directly through translators. Mm-hmm. And it's very dramatic, but very inaccurate, because what they actually installed were two teletype machines.
Lordy.
So you'd have instantaneous printout of what the other side was writing to you.
Okay.
And no Western Union cyclist or anything like that involved. So a definite improvement. By the way, they did use the hotline later on. For example, the 1973 Mideast War.
Yeah.
They used the hotline. Yeah. So that was an improvement, certainly. No offense to Western Union.
Yeah. By the way, just to throw in a plug for a great film, which Dr. Strangelove, the Henry Fonda movie that Dr. Nash just mentioned, Failsafe, was the inspiration, I think, then for the later Dr.
Actually, no. They were both inspired by the same book, by the title Failsafe.
Oh.
And Failsafe is sort of the serious version of the movie, and Dr. Strangelove is the not so serious, although far better. Right. By the way, if not on my top 5 list, certainly on my top 10 list. If people haven't seen Dr. Strangelove, they need to see it.
Oh, my goodness.
It's an absolutely brilliant movie. Absolutely. By the way, we may want to do a show about Dr. Strangelove someday, because there's some interesting backstory to some of that stuff.
Well, we should do a show about the book and both movies.
Yeah, exactly, because there was another book at the same time called Red Alert a British book.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which was similar. And I think some of them got fused in the script writing process.
Well, here we go, Buzzkillers. You're seeing the sort of how the sausage is made here at the Institute.
Exactly. But do we have to listen to them workshop their next show? Yeah. So there was a thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. There was about a 6 or 9 month real sharp dip in Soviet-Cuban relations.
Oh.
Castro was, by the way, he was not consulted. By the way, the Turks were not consulted. Castro was not consulted. And when Castro found out that Khrushchev was pulling the missiles out, he flipped his stuff. He had some real choice words, which deserve an R rating at best. And that he actually visited the Soviet Union in the spring of 1963 to sort of iron things out. And by the way, the Cubans became much more adventurous internationally, including sending troops to places like Angola. Part of their reason, but part of the reason was the Soviet Union, they're too timid, they're too conservative.
Yeah.
We're going to sort of bust out on our own and have our own foreign policy, maybe cooperate with the Chinese a little bit more. So that's interesting too. But more important, big picture, to my mind, is just how this crisis, among other things, demonstrates how problematic nuclear weapons are, to put it very mildly.
Yeah, right.
It is true that nuclear weapons can be and were stabilizing in some ways, right? We had a world war in 1914, we had a world war in 1939, and then we had no world war, knock on wood, certainly not in Europe, for decades and decades afterwards.
Yeah, and why is that?
That is because of nuclear weapons. Yeah. Most scholars would agree that nuclear weapons have a sobering effect. They have a deterrent effect. You don't launch World War III because of the possible consequences. Right. So that is really important. There's a flip side, though, and that is that if you look not just the missile crisis, but particularly in the missile crisis, nuclear weapons also cause the problems they are supposed to prevent. They not only deter, they also provoke. And that's true in part with the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. It's certainly the case with missiles in Cuba. Even if your main motive is to defend Cuba, you have provoked the United States and arguably risk not only the Cubans, but also yourselves and the rest of humankind because of your rash action using nuclear weapons. But like I said, by this point, nuclear weapons are they're a go-to, right? When in doubt, solve your problem with nuclear weapons. And it almost ended up World War III. And, they deter when you're rational. But rationality is not the only factor here. Like I said, you have the risk of accident. And by the way, the list I gave you earlier about the accidents and incidents going on during the crisis, that was a partial list. There are many, many others. Some of them quite harrowing. Like, for example, someone accidentally putting a practice launch tape into the machine at our early warning radar that had been turned and pointed to Cuba. And for a minute, the people in that station thought, oh, they've launched their missiles from Cuba. And they made some frantic phone calls and then discovered, oh, no. No, jackass. Someone put the wrong tape in the machine. Anyway, that happens. Anyway, so you might accidentally launch World War III, even though we didn't intend it. Which is to say, to put it in other words, in October 1962, we got lucky. And recent events in Ukraine, where, by the way, there's all sorts of new interest in the nuclear arms race and nuclear weapons for some very good reasons. Ukraine should remind us that our nuclear weapons are still with us. Our arsenals are smaller than they were in 1962, but they're still enormous, right? Yeah. Each side still has, I think each side has something like 1,700 strategic nuclear weapons. That's still a great deal. That still represents overkill. And we might not be so lucky the next time. And I will leave the last word to the famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who around 1970 wrote about the missile crisis. And he said, and I'm quoting, "We were in luck, but success in a lottery is no argument for lotteries." Yeah. You're lucky when you're playing Russian roulette and you don't shoot yourself. Yeah, but it's safer just to leave that gun on the table. Exactly. Or maybe not to have that gun in the first place. Exactly. Well, Professor, once again, you've enlightened us about something extremely important. Again, we've updated what we talked about many years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, so that's important. But I want Buzzkillers to know a couple of things. The first is that, as all of you regular listeners know, Professor Nash provides us with these great outlines that help me prepare the show and help the show flow normally and everything. But in this show, I had to force myself to look back at the outline because I was so gripped at what he was saying. I was looking directly at him, as if, like a television documentary. That's how important this topic is, and that's how well he explains it. So thank you, Professor, so much for coming on the show about this topic. My pleasure. And Buzzkillers, please go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com for all the fun
and all the terror, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the shows about history, myths, and misunderstandings. And do me a huge favor, please, please, please go onto Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcast platform is and rate us and give us a review. It makes a huge difference in how we move up the rankings, how Apple and other companies spread the word about our show, and we desperately need the word spread. So again, thanks to everyone, and we will talk to all of you out there next week.